All right, guys. So I've brought up Curtis Yarvin in the past. I don't know if you were watching or not. The entire video wasn't about him, but it kind of went into him and the dark enlightenment, so to speak. He is, at least in recent times, probably the biggest right wing philosopher in terms of the amount of people on the right that he has got excited and kind of they've followed him and his literary work. Um, he has been instrumental in the shaping of J.D. Vance, for example, although I don't think he's ever met him. He's, in my opinion, very dangerous, and it kind of makes me think like I'm pretty big on freedom of speech, but and I still maintain that it's important regardless of whether or not you agree with the message. But he has a way of slipping like very in my opinion poisonous messages and dressing it up as healthy. He's very intelligent. Um but instead of just talking shit about him, I'd like to actually cover him in an interview and like listen and kind of chime in periodically. Um, it's difficult to do with Curtis Yarvin because he tends to do really, really long stuff. He's also really similar to like Jordan Peterson. Sometimes he just won't answer questions directly and he goes into a long spiel and will like kind of teeter around the question for a while, and then he has to constantly be like pushed back on track. Um, I have that problem myself, so I'm not even really talking shit about it, but I'm explaining why it's difficult to kind of get something for it. The particular video that I chose is only like 30 minutes, and it's hard to find anything that short without actually just being a single like short YouTube short clip, which is nothing. So we'll check this out. It's entitled, Should the U.S. Be a Monarchy? Curtis Yarvin Makes the Case. This is his attempt to convince, particularly Americans, that we would be better off as a monarchy. Let me go ahead and present and get this going. I may not finish this. It depends on how things go. It's kind of late for me. In any case, I'll always provide the link in case you want to do so yourself.
Hey, everyone, it's Andrew Clavin with this week's interview with Curtis Yarvin. Now, you may not know Yarvin. He's a really, really interesting thinker. He used to write under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug. And I don't know exactly where to place him on the political axis. He's usually referred to as a reactionary right-winger, but...
Interesting. So this is going to be a little treat because... Hold on, I can't think. Doing two things at once. It's not someone that I think is going to be especially combative toward him. So it's going to give me especially like a completely different view and a different lens through which to look at him and to see how he reacts. Because I have not seen any of this video, just as a heads up. But this guy is from Daily Wire, which already tells me a lot. Although I'll be open-minded or try to be. So like right off the bat, I'm going to assume that he's going to be appreciative of Curtis Yarvin's ideas, and that's something that I haven't seen yet. I've generally only seen Curtis Yarvin in interviews where he's being pushed back against, or quite a bit anyway. So let's get this going and see what happens.
Some far left people like him as well. And I've been listening to a lot of the young dissident right on podcasts, just trying to figure out what they're thinking. And we had Jay Burden on, I remember, and almost all of them cite Curtis as an inspiration. He has a Substack called Gray Mirror. He has a book called Unqualified Reservations. And just for those of you just to remind you, the way I do interviews, I bring people on for one reason, which is to find out what they have to say. I'm not here to argue with them or struggle with them. I hope I ask good exploratory questions, but I don't necessarily agree with them. But I'm not going to scream at them. I actually want to hear them. It's different than what you've heard. So Curtis, thank you so much for coming on. It's a real pleasure to meet you. I've been reading a lot of your things and very, very interesting stuff.
Great pleasure to come on, Andrew. I suppose I always struggle with this question of what to call myself, like in a sort of branding sense. Recently, I came up with the phrase radical monarchist, which, the radical has this kind of nice Berkeley kind of sound to it. And then you're like a monarchist, but maybe you're not the kind of monarchist who believes in Queen Elizabeth II and, King Charles III. Maybe more you're the kind of monarchist who believes in Queen Elizabeth I and
okay.
Henry VIII.
Well, this is what I want to get to, because I listen to these.
If you'll let me keep going.
Yes, please.
But
please.
I think I know where you want me to go. It's like, when we read the past, we're always struck by, I think some historian once said, we understand the Roman Empire and maybe even to some extent the Roman Republic better than anyone who ever lived in the Roman Empire. And that's because whenever you're inside a society, it's in this kind of, what we call in Silicon Valley, a reality distortion field. It's inside a little bubble of very deeply unquestioned assumptions. And, one of the reasons to really get into the past is to understand, is to have an external perspective on that bubble of unquestioned assumptions that we all live inside.
So far, I actually agree with him. I can tell, and he's sort of tentative. I think he's working up to something that's going to be the poison that I described. And he's kind of making it easier to swallow right now. I could be wrong. But so far, I agree with him.
And one way to do that is to understand the past well enough that you can get advice from the past. And specifically, that you could actually know what, for example, here's just a random question. Suppose you could put Elizabeth I in a time machine, and she could go back and look at the England of Elizabeth II. What you going to think? And the thing is, if you can't really, as a person who, I guess we have King Charles III now, but as a person who lived for basically 50 years in the age of Queen Elizabeth II, to answer that question, I would have to have a very good understanding of both Elizabethan eras. That's a good test for how well you can look at your society from the outside.
Okay.
And so, to answer that question really, really briefly, I would say that the answer, the start of the answer is obvious, which is that Queen Elizabeth I, as we all know, is at least to a substantial extent an actual governing monarch. She's actually the Queen of England.
So I have to start with an admission. I don't know shit about either of these people. So I'm already starting from like a bad place, but I mean, there's no point in lying about it. It seems to be, though, that he's obviously pushing that societies work better when there's one person in complete and total control. But let's continue.
She's actually the CEO of the English government, as we would say in the corporate world today. She is to the government of England what Elon Musk is to SpaceX. People might do stuff, does she know where every sparrow falls or every memo flies? No, but she's actually in charge. And maybe you could quibble with that as an Elizabethan historian, and then you really have to go back to Henry VIII, who's really in charge, or maybe even Henry VII. And who's so in charge that he's not even notorious. And so the thing is that what someone who certainly conceived of it as her own responsibility to be in charge would think of someone who nominally had the same job as her, but in fact was basically a crowned Kardashian who only did photo ops and basically, was there for the tourist trade. Right. So I think that, I think there are more things that Elizabeth I would think about Elizabeth II's England, but she would be coming from that initial perspective.
Right.
She would be coming from the initial perspective of this is crazy. And this woman is extremely deluded. And she actually thinks she's the queen, but she is not the queen. And, then she would look at this and that about England and she would be like, oh my God.
So that is what when you call yourself a monarchist, you want a governing, powerful monarch.
Yeah. And so, the thing is, why would anyone call themselves a monarchist in the year 2024? Well, if you look around you, I'm looking into some very delicate computer hardware right now. When I opened the box that contained that computer hardware, it said designed by Apple in California, made in China. Now, those are 3 brand names there: Apple, California, and China. Okay, 2 of these things are monarchies, and one of them is something else. Apple is a monarchy. Apple is literally run by a single CEO. It's an accountable monarchy. Tim Cook is accountable to the board. Mark Zuckerberg actually is not accountable to the board because he has special magic shares that keep him not accountable. China is a monarchy, and it's run by Xi Jinping, who is, again, accountable to the Chinese Communist Party to some extent. But, is there such a thing as a sort of perfect, ideally absolute monarchy? No. But when we see, quote, constitutional monarchies throughout history, we notice that they very, very quickly degrade into ceremonial monarchies.
Right.
You could argue that basically, for example, in England after the Restoration, the period of Charles II was a period where there was a genuine balance between the monarchical power and the parliament. Obviously, they kicked out James and replaced him with basically a fake king, right? England has had fake kings for 300 years. Japan has had fake emperors for 1,000 years. I don't know how many people know this, but the emperor of Japan was last in charge of Japan in the 1100s, 1200s, something like that, right? Since then, it's all been shoguns ruling in the emperor's name.
Tossing and turning all night is a frustrating experience. You can take it from me because that's all I ever do. But there is a way that I found that I can at least get some sleep. When sleep is elusive, it's physically and mentally draining. That's why I love being. There are no E's. I just make it look this easy.
There are no E's in fate.
Can I back you up just a second?
Yeah.
When you were talking about the computer, it's made by Apple in California. Is your point there that only 2 of those entities
Imagine
are functioning?
if the state of California tried to make a computer.
Okay.
Imagine if the state of California tried to make an electric car. Now, they wouldn't actually pretend. There was a time when these projects could be done this is not a permanent quality of government, the way libertarians think.
Right.
The Manhattan Project was the most successful and effective engineering project of all time. It was a government project. And when we look at that project, we see that it was run almost exactly like a Silicon Valley startup, right down to having the technical and the non-technical co-founder. So it's really more a diarchy than a monarchy is one thing that sort of Silicon Valley's kind of had this kind of minor variation on the design. But mostly, if you want to get anything actually done in this world, You give it to one person and hold him accountable, him or her accountable for their results.
But doesn't Silicon Valley produce the ideas that these people then actualize? I mean, in other words,
Oh, sure,
all the
but the
people who are living in
actualization,
California. Yeah.
If you go to DC, you'll see a lot of ideas, in and around the government. There is no shortage of ideas in and around the government. But the government, because of the way the administrative state operates, and this is one of the things that I think is most important for people to understand, is the difference between a private corporation and the administrative state, the deep state, whatever you want to call it. Yes, the fact that people can't be fired is an obvious difference in the deep state, but it's so much deeper than that, right? I actually grew up in the deep state. So my dad was a foreign service officer. My mom was a DOE. My stepfather was on the Hill. So I kind of have a certain familial understanding of the way DC operates, and also have a personal understanding of the way Silicon Valley operates, because I've been a CEO here in a small way. So like, these things are night and day. And so the thing is, when you look at the federal government, there are times in the past when it has worked as a monarchy. FDR, I have a lot of bad things to say about FDR, but like him or not, he was the monarch of America. And if you look at the way the New Deal operated, imagine a world in which Washington is as efficient as a startup, and actually kind of runs like a startup, and is kind of young and fresh and full of really talented people, and works kind of like Uber. And you'll understand why people develop this immense trust in like the deep state, this generational trust. It's like the way people trust Apple or Google, but like even more so. It did incredible things. It conquered the world. Like, like you have to respect, when you look at this monstrous, cancerous blight that is Washington, D.C., you can't forget the fact that like 75 years ago, it conquered the freaking world.
Right.
Right. And so
he seems to come from a place of competition. Like, that seems to be the lens through which he views everything. Efficiency is his primary goal. There's a lot of problems with what he's saying. Like, for one, he's specifically focusing on the from his point of view, positive components of this absolute power. Secondly, he's making this nonchalant comparison between companies and countries as if they're synonymous. He does it so like without question that it makes me kind of like, what the fuck? Like, that's not a valid comparison at all. Like, companies do operate basically like monarchies, and I think that's a problem already. So, as in anything in the world, shit's complicated. There's pros and cons to everything. So, yes, you do get faster, more efficient, if you like what they're doing, progress when you have one person in charge. That's why China can get shit done very, very quickly. There's several problems. One is human nature. I've yet to see an example of an absolute dictator, so to speak, or monarch, whatever you want to say, in history. Now, I'm not a history buff, but still, I know enough to where, like, I should be able to think of like a couple of examples, but I can't, where power corrupts was not a factor. One person, human being, cannot handle that kind of power. You end up seeing what, like look at Russia. Russia is basically a monarchy under Putin. He of course, we all know it's bullshit, but he kind of masquerades it as a democracy, but it's not true. There's not fair elections. He fucking basically assassinates anyone who could potentially rival him, like he did with Alexei Navalny. He is essentially the perfect example of what Curtis Yarvin is describing. He is a CEO of a country. He views it as a company, as a profit-making like expenditure, or yeah, I guess. So he's basically a mob boss. He and this is what happens when people get that kind of power. And so he started with this like like you can have that sort of power, but they are held accountable. That does not happen, not to the extent that he's trying to frame it. And that's where I go with this is insane just from a human nature standpoint. Like it just doesn't work. It has never worked. And it always leads to tyranny and absolute shit for your average everyday citizen. Now, obviously, I'm on the left. The average everyday human being, especially those that are like marginalized in some way, especially economically, tends to be where my focus is, as it should be, in my opinion. Those people are in far worse shape under these dictators and always have been throughout history. Anyhow, I've said enough. I'm going to continue for now.
On the other hand, if basically you gave everyone at Apple a permanent job for 80 years and like made it completely unaccountable to market results. I mean, Apple went downhill very quickly without Steve Jobs. And
Right.
like it was a death's door.
But my question though, just to go back for a second, the computer revolution, like many other technical fracking revolution, came out of the kind of mess of America. It came out of these people.
Sure.
Who were,
So the thing is, when we think of monarchy as a kind of an organizing force, what we see is actually like, if you're looking for a system that is this kind of single unified monarchy where the king tells everyone to do, you're looking at the world, the ancient Incas, right? The Inca civilization was like this. It was just incredibly, unbelievably, absolutely totalitarian. And so what you see in successful systems is that it's like laying tile or something. You have these blocks of monarchy, and then the blocks are competing with each other and holding each other accountable through competitive tensions. Do you remember, the movie The Third Man, of course?
Yeah, sure. One of my favorites.
That great Orson Welles speech about Italy and the cuckoo clock. Did you know that Orson Welles actually ad-libbed that speech? It wasn't in the script.
Yeah, I know.
God knows where he came up with it. But, here's this incredible insight. And this insight is running absolutely counter to what everyone believed at the time, because this is the era of Wendell Willkie, like one world. People really believed in the United Nations. They thought it was going to be like the EU, but for the world at the time that this movie is made, right? And so basically when Orson Welles comes out and says, he just says it like he really knows it. I mean, the history is all false. All these Swiss kings were fighting each other, right? But when he says this kind of deep truth that's so counter to what everyone believes in that moment, it's just creates this really powerful, moment, because everyone in this, in their bones knows that it's true. It's like, it's the fact, what keeps Apple effective. It's a little tough because Apple is kind of a monopoly in some ways. But imagine Apple without Android, right? It would be a lot fatter and happier and basically more on its way toward evolving into something like the Department of Energy. Most people don't know that the Department of Energy is the lineal bureaucratic successor of the Manhattan Project. And it actually evolves into DOE. And so when you look at the federal government, this is the point that's really important to note, is that the most important difference between Apple and, say, the Department of Energy or the state of California, which is only in a way a symbolic difference, even the fact that it's a monarchy is different. What's important is that Apple operates on what the U.S. military calls mission orders. The idea of mission orders, there's a German name for it, but that doesn't mean the Nazis invented it. The Germans call it Auftragstactic, and it's a military idea, and the idea is that you don't micromanage. It's as simple as that. You have some people who work for you. You've got a mission to accomplish. You've got resources. You're like, okay, you do this, you do that. You don't tell them how to do it. The captain doesn't tell the lieutenant how to take the hill, just what hill to take. This principle is fundamental to any large organization. It's the principle of basically you don't get to question the mission, but you get to implement the mission however you see fit. Okay, this principle is profoundly alien to the functioning of the U.S. federal government and the civil service in particular. This is why anything that actually needs to get done gets contracted out. Because actually the way the civil service operates is on the basis of process. So if you're in the civil service, basically there's a process, there's literally a law that's, in many cases, that's describing what you're there to do. Let's say you're a vice consul at a, consulate in Santo Domingo, which was my dad's first job back in the 70s in the State Department.
I'm a little bit confused on his points here, because it seems like his overarching point is that he believes one person with one message, one ideology and unified front on what they want to do, no questions asked, is the best way for efficiency for an entire group of people. It seems to be especially in the sense of efficiency toward being the best, whatever. See, even that's subjective, because what do you consider the best country? You ask 10 people, you're going to get 10 different answers, or at least several different answers. But then he's going into describing German military philosophy and how people were given orders but were not told how to do it. And those two things are very conflicting. They what the fuck? I don't understand. He seems to be, he's coming from two different extreme angles. It's is there not any cognitive dissonance there? What? Maybe he'll elaborate and I'll understand in a moment.
Your job is to apply U.S. immigration law.
Right.
And there's a process for applying U.S. immigration law. That law basically describes what you're doing. You're not nobody comes to you and is like, hey, Herb, why don't we pick out 10 guys today who we think would make really good Americans?
Can I interrupt you for a sec? Because there's so much,
Sure.
There's so much coming at me that I really have to parse some of it and just take some of it apart. So I understand, because obviously the first thing that, conservatives theoretically are supposed to be worried about is freedom, is people having the freedom to, and the idea, remember that the ideas coming out of an Apple or any company are generated by the profit motive. They want to make money, so that they have the freedom to collect this money and keep some substantial amount of it. So they are inspired to do that. All of those.
So do you know that? Do you know? I think can I anticipate? I think your question.
Okay.
So do you know the concept of the theory of the firm? This is a basic economics concept, and the idea is why is Apple one block? Why don't instead you have a bunch of people basically signing contracts with each other? So in order to implement the functioning that is Apple, why isn't Apple, why doesn't Apple in a libertarian contract oriented world, why do we still even have concepts like employee? Why don't we basically just make deals between individuals, and all of those agreements between individuals add up to Apple?
Right.
I used to be a libertarian, so I can speak libertarian pretty good. In fact, this laptop is resting on 3 copies of Murray Rothbard. So the answer again is that basically, and I think this is one thing, it's sort of it's very interesting that historically, we live in an age when to be a conservative is to emphasize freedom over, for example, duty, order, family, responsibility.
Well, I think all those
Freedom
things are
is
necessary for freedom, but yeah.
Yes. Well, yes, exactly. And so in a way, basically, I think that the conception of freedom that kind of goes
with
Wanted to kind of chime in anyway, this damn ad. This has never made sense to me. Conservatives always talk about the importance of freedom, Yet there's always it's like freedom asterisk. It's like freedom for their shit, not for everything and everyone. They're the most controlling, and they strip freedom far more than the left does. Like, look right now at Donald Trump. They're like, conservatives will say that Donald Trump is preserving or creating or bringing back freedom. Yet, when you look at it literally, his actual actions, he has done more to destroy freedom than any other president in recent history. When the state, especially socially, as anyone that has a libertarian mind should know right off the bat, especially when it comes to social shit, if you're a libertarian and you believe in freedom, especially, social shit is like the fringe. It does not affect people to the extent of like crime, like fucking, well, crime is kind of arbitrary because it's whatever the law is. But I guess, for example, it's not like punching people in the face. Like, we're not talking about that. It's like when it's put into like hierarchies of like damage to individuals, social shit is like the least damaging, right? It's like whoever you like politically, you're free to like whoever you like. Whoever you love, you're free to love whoever you love. It doesn't harm anyone else. Who gives a shit? Trump has made efforts to destroy those things more than any president in recent history, maybe ever. He is like personally attacked, like his like quote war on woke. That itself is, whether you're capable of understanding this or not, that is like a massive infringement on freedom. And that's what I mean when I say freedom with an asterisk. It's like your freedom. It's not freedom in general. It's like your specific kind of freedom, which is not freedom at all. It's like, it's so weird. Like, how are conservatives not able to understand this? It's like they're constantly contradicting themselves on issues. It's like they have something that they feel should be like important, but then they don't hold to it. It's like their values are like fake. It's like their values aren't actual values, because if they were, what they considered a value would stand firm no matter what. So if for example, a conservative were to say that they cared about social freedom, and as long as people aren't harming other people, they can do whatever they want, they wouldn't be like, oh, fuck you gay people. They wouldn't even think that. And if they did, they would keep it to themselves because they believe in that freedom, but they don't. And Donald Trump has made several different fucking attempts to destroy fucking freedom in that regard. He's attacked trans people. He's attacked people over quote unquote DEI, even though it doesn't even really mean anything at this point. It's like a dog whistle, really. He just uses it when he wants an excuse to fucking get rid of people or like have something to attack, when it's not even really a fucking, like, it's not a valid thing to attack, at least in a vast majority of cases. It's really dumb, and I don't understand why they can't see this. It's like, anyway, I'm just going to continue.
Spectrum's easy self-install kit.
Turn on the anniversary mix.
You can feel at home in minutes.
You know, back before the American era in the European tradition, is that the amount of freedom that is healthy for any person or any system is completely dependent on the nature of that person or system. My 16-year-old daughter, for example, needs a very different level of freedom from my 17-month-old son. So, you know, if you have a child who's a heroin addict and they're 25, they need about as much freedom as an 18-month-old. And so, just as, those are examples just on the individual level. And then what we see is that, again, freedom is in a sense the opposite of contract. So when you sign an employment contract for Apple, you give up all kinds of freedoms for like very, very large parts of your day. You agree to basically be part of this ordered system for getting things done, for making these frankly amazing laptops that could only be done in this structure that is remarkably reminiscent of an army or a plantation or a manorial castle or something very, very antiquated. And then you look at the way the really important things in our world are done, because as libertarian as you can be, you're always going to admit that the jobs, whether you go full Hans Hermann Hoppe and you believe in like private national defense, there is still a job that needs to be done there. Only the dead have seen the end of war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we agree that the jobs that we assign to government are in general much more important jobs than like making a really sleek laptop that just doesn't crash.
So he's making a number of like logical mistakes here, in my opinion. So again, he keeps comparing a country to a corporation, which is a terrible analogy, because profit is not your end goal when you're a country, or it shouldn't be. If it is, you're a failed country. If you only exist for profit, then morality never comes into the picture. If morality never comes into the picture, then especially the people on the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak, get fucked. And I mean hard. Always. There's very, very few exceptions to that, and you're not going to convince me that his way would somehow magically avoid that. That's the problem. So he also, it's hard to wrap my thoughts around this. I should have paused more frequently, because he covers quite a bit, as the host here said. And it leaves me with like 5 or 6 things that I want to say, and then like my brain gets tangled up. So what specifically was I going to touch? Give me a moment. Brain just went dead. Let me do a quick go back. We're at 2154.
Defense, there is still a job that needs to be done there. Only the dead have seen.
Oh yeah. So he's pushing this overarching view that like when one person is in charge, essentially, things get done, and things get done efficiently. And he's making this comparison of like our system now, but he's leaving out that we already have the examples that he pushed tackled remarkably well. For instance, when he talks about a drug addict and their level of freedom, or he uses the example of his whatever month-old child or whatever, one, we have a social framework that already addresses those. So maybe they wouldn't be perfect in your view, which is highly subjective, but at least when it comes to an individual, it all depends on their personal priorities. So I think what Curtis Yarvin's doing is he is looking at the world through this really rigid view of his values. And he's hard forcing those values onto the world and assuming that if his values were implemented by some strong, iron-fisted leader, then the world would be great. The problem is a huge swath of people aren't going to agree on what those values should be, which is why we have, at least it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, it's why we have a system that's more akin to what we have now than what he's describing, because you won't get that. It just won't happen. He's also, he seems to be kind of circling around getting freedom from, he doesn't use the word, but essentially a dictator. That does not happen. It has not happened historically. It will not happen in the future. It's so weird that he's doing that. Like, secondly, the same problem that you would have with that we already have with massive corporations, Apple is the example he keeps using, we would have if there was like a massive CEO leader for a country. Profit, power, whatever that individual wants the most, which tends to kind of shift whenever they get absolute power anyway, will become what's most important for everyone. That's how it always works. There's no exception to this. And like, as we see now, where there's constantly lawsuits and they're not even that great. Like, usually, like in our system, it's like an oligarchy. If you're wealthy, you get away with whatever the fuck you want for the most part, most of the time. When like fucking Wall Street was, whenever they fucking all like threw the fucking farm at like fucking making risky maneuvers in order to make profit, and the fucking government bailed them out, all that taught them is that they could do whatever the fuck they want and there will be no consequences. None of them were fucking put behind bars. So the least thing that we need is something akin to a corporation, like a massive corporation, in place of the government. Then we're going to get what we have in like Russia, where it's like one man who fucking stomps on everyone below him. Everyone below him is generally miserable unless they suck his dick, and then he gives them like a little slice. But yeah, it just does not work.
The end of war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we agree that the jobs that we assign to government are in general much more important jobs than like making a really sleek laptop that just doesn't crash. Right. And actually making a sleek laptop that doesn't crash is much more important than what most companies do.
So you want the government to be run like a corporation, essentially?
Sure. That's a very, very... But that's a simple thing to say.
Yeah.
But when you imagine what it means, people will pay lip service to that. But the thing is, when people pay lip service to that, they don't understand. It's like saying, let's say I have a Soviet tractor factory, and I say in 1991, and I say the Soviet tractor factory should be run like a corporation. Well, for, 80 years, this tractor factory has been running as a Soviet bureaucracy.
This was my hair 6 hours after wash day. Now this is my hair on day 3. I've tried every oily hair.
So my first question is, why should I keep any of these people? Why should I keep any of these assets? Why, like...
The only thing that's troubling me here, just in terms of clarity, is Apple theoretically doesn't have the right to have me arrested. It doesn't have the right to come to my house and say, you're worshiping the wrong God, I'm going to set you on fire. Where the king does, kind of, I mean, and that's a tremendous power. And the thing that the founders are always fiddling with is, how do we keep that power from getting out of control?
Sure. And the founders are actually fiddling with a couple of founders, I don't think the founders would find our current system to much resemble.
Oh, I think they go nuts. Really. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I think they would just be like, what does this have to do with us? Right. And I think that they would have the same reaction as like, Roman senators from 200 BC looking at the empire in 400 AD. They would just be like, what does this have to do with us? Right. Why do you still call it the Roman Republic? What's up with that? But they were actually struggling, one of the things that, there's a couple of things when people talk about the founders, and I kind of got into this in my infamous debate with Chris Rufo the other day. There's a couple of things to remind ourselves when we talk about the founders. One is that we tend to do this weird thing where we telescope the revolution of the 1770s into the Constitution, which is a phenomenon of the 1780s. And because as you may know, the Constitution is actually the second American republic. You know how the French give their republicist numbers. The first republic is the Articles of Confederation, the Congress of the Confederation.
Yeah, and I was thinking of that as you were speaking before. But
that's right.
But the
that's right.
problems
That's
remain
right.
the same. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And here's a test for how you think about early American history. When you think about the first republic, other than the history of its army, what do you know about the history of the Articles of Confederation period, bearing in mind that the Congress of the Confederation is lasts about 13 years?
Yeah, they felt that the Constitution did not centralize enough power, basically.
Do you know any of the names of the leaders? Do you know any of the events? Do you know what happened during that period?
Oh,
it's
gosh,
it's a complete white spot on your brain. It's like it's been, X-rayed out with a...
I admit he's right. I don't know shit about this. I didn't even know what the host brought up there.
Protein with a proton knife. You actually don't know anything about it. And the thing is that one of the reasons we don't generally understand that period in terms of, for example, right-left politics in America. But actually, if you go back and read the period like this, it's sort of what snaps into your mind very, very clearly is that by the late 1780s, pretty much everyone everyone responsible in the country, because the mob was really a thing at this time, pretty much everyone in the, responsible in the country thought that this experiment in basically LARPing Greek democracy, LARPing Athenian democracy was not working, and what was needed was something more Roman.
Right.
And of course, they were very, very into the classics at that time. Specifically, as you probably know the background in which, people are like, hey, George Washington, do you want to be the king? And he's like, no. Okay, right. So what the Constitution is a right-wing coup that basically establishes the quasi-monarchy of the Federalist Party. And within the Federalist Party, you have basically the co-founders of the United States government, who are Washington and Hamilton.
But what I want to know, wait, the question that I'm asking, though, is how do you answer the question, or do you care about the question, which is also fair? What are we going to do to limit the powers of the king?
How do you, so first of all, there's one of the classic or one of the fundamental kind of errors in terms of pre-democratic political science.
He's doing that thing that I mentioned where he kind of goes off and into an entire aside and doesn't answer the question. I think it's because he knows that the answer is not going to be well received by a majority of the people. So he's doing everything he can to soften it first, and then he kind of gets lost in it. I do that myself sometimes, like I said. So again, I can't talk shit about that, but like the intent or perceived intent is what matters here. So he also goes back to like, this is what the founding fathers like actually wanted originally, and this is what became instead. So my answer to that would be, I don't give a fuck what the original founding fathers wanted. I'm not a fucking like hardcore, like the founding fathers are gods and whatever they wanted is everything. What I care about is what is the best for the most people. And a monarchy, no matter how you stretch it, no matter how many mental gymnastics you use, will not be that system. Guaranteed. It will harm more people than it helps, as it always has. And I would really be interested in hearing him explain why that's not the case, because I'm sure he would disagree with me on that.
Is that you don't, when the problem that you're facing in creating an accountable monarchy is you're actually caught between Scylla and Charybdis, because you need the CEO to not be micromanaged in any way. You need him to actually be the CEO, but you need him to be accountable. If you've hung around in the private sector much, for example, the way they solve this problem at Apple is they have a board of directors. And what's really important about this system, which, by the way, the word president was actually originally a corporate title before it was a political title. So the founders had some experience with basically the kind of rising sort of corporate form. They knew how to form organizations very, very effectively. So, for example, in the Constitution, which was actually really supposed to be an accountable monarchy of this type, and which did function kind of as a startup under Alexander Hamilton, what was supposed to do this job was the Electoral College. And they didn't realize that politics would basically like blast through the Electoral College as if they'd put an overly weak seal on a nuclear reactor. They really thought that the Electoral College was going to be a bunch of like anonymous, not anonymous, of like, prominent statesmen who would choose basically the candidates for president as if they were like CEO search firm. So that was basically kind of the start of their design. Of course, like any system that you don't get a chance to test before it's shipped, like the Electoral College just never worked at all. So when you're basically looking at the Constitution sort of in this way, like a software engineer, you're like, oh, I see what they were trying to do here. And, you can also see what they were trying to do because they wrote about it in the Federalist Papers. Now,
going into an office, working 50 hours a week, having that structure.
So they really understood the concept of an executive. They really understood the nature of an executive branch. As I often say, we don't have an executive branch today. We have an administrative branch. It's a completely different thing.
And that's exactly what we need. In fact, Trump is trying to make it, he's got the unitary executive theory, and he's trying to basically get rid of other branches of government, or at least their checks on him. And that is absolutely fucking the American people. So it's like, we don't need to go into history right now. Your ideas are fucking us, and he doesn't even have the power that he would have under your perfect fucking government. Like, I really can't wrap my head around why he thinks this is a good idea.
And it's run by process set down by the judicial and legislative branches. Really, like, you don't need to steal an election in this country because the president doesn't have any power over the executive branch. And what to do about changing that is one thing, but like, you think you're electing Queen Elizabeth I out there, but you're actually electing Queen Elizabeth II.
Tell that to Donald Trump, who has been numerous times tried to be checked by both Congress and the fucking judicial branch, and he's just completely ignored it, and nobody's doing anything about it. Like, it's like we live in two different worlds here. Let me see when this was. This was 10 months ago. Yeah. Kind of makes a little bit more sense. But it's still like, it's almost as if, see, he said it 10 months ago, or at least this was aired 10 months ago. But now we're seeing that even slight strides in the direction that he's talking about are very, very bad for most people. Like, obviously.
Okay. And if that's the only thing you learned from me today, I think that's
that's
probably the best.
A fair assertion. I would like, I was going to say that I would be willing to have a monarchy if we have Queen Elizabeth I, but I'm afraid of all those other guys.
Here's the thing, just so sort of
right, I've got 1 minute, Curtis. So you got to,
To put it in perspective, basically, so I have various gimcrack designs for trying to make a monarchy completely safe. They're a lot too much to go into, here. But the basic question is that human history has run for thousands of years on one of three operating platforms: monarchy, oligarchy, or democracy. What we have here is not a democracy because the people aren't powerful enough to rule it. Very simply, like, there's no alternatives besides oligarchy and democracy. What you got is an oligarchy. Now, you can say, well, a lot of crazy things can happen in a monarchy. King can go insane. He can get a brain tumor or whatever. Yeah, that's dangerous, you know? But if you look at the record of like true monarchies before the age of revolution, you're not seeing Hitler. You're not seeing Stalin. You're seeing some who are good and some are okay. You know what? Pick any one of the Fortune 500 CEOs. He'll probably do fine. He won't start the second Holocaust.
I gotta stop here, but it's really interesting talking to you, Curtis. I'd like you to come back. I hope we'll get to do it again.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks so
All right.
much. Pleasure,
Thanks a lot.
Andrew.
It's nice to meet you.
Completely disagree with him. In fact, in large part, he's sort of like making projections about the future on something that we haven't really seen, because he's using like far back history to come to his current conclusions, and the world changes, things change. By the way, even with those monarchies that he's saying that weren't like fucking Stalin or Hitler, they did some really fucking evil shit. He's leaving all that out conveniently. And like, if any of like the Fortune 500 CEOs became the leader, we would be fine. That is absolute bullshit, because we don't hear commonly about all of the fucking corrupt ass bullshit that these CEOs do. You don't reach that level by being decent people ever, or very, very, very rarely. I don't think there's any human being that's a CEO of any of the Fortune 500 fucking companies that I would trust, because they got there by being ruthless, by stepping on other people and essentially taking their share. That's how they rise. It's how it works in our system. Putting a person with that mentality in fucking complete control is possibly the stupidest thing you could ever think of doing. Like, that's a recipe for disaster. I do agree with him on the three essential types of systems or platforms that we've run on. And I do agree that we are currently an oligarchy. 100% agree on that. It's obvious that he's right. But I believe that it would be far better if we became at least closer to a democracy. Now, there is a problem in that. And I think I would kind of be throwing a bone at him, and we'd be sort of agreeing on this one point. If it's a complete and total democracy, then there's a big issue. So most people are, by definition, not smart, because smart is a term that holds value only in its like lack of it's not common, basically. Otherwise it wouldn't mean anything, right? Just like dumb. So giving everyone the power to make decisions is it has a lot of risk to it. I still think that's better than letting one person make all the decisions. Even if that person like agreed with me on pretty much every issue, human nature, I believe personally, would take over. They would become corrupt. They would crave more and more power, just like every fucking powerful leader in the past has. And there's no way that you can put accountability, as he describes, on those people. It doesn't work. It's against human nature. It won't ever work. So we disagree on that. But I don't know how to solve. Like, I think the best answer to the stupidity problem, or maybe not even calling it stupidity, but like, because that implies intelligence. For me, it's more about knowledge. It's about lack of education. People, like, in my opinion, the reason why we have Donald Trump is because a huge swath of the nation has absolutely no fucking clue about politics at all. They know nothing. And I think that a big solution to that, or at least a step forward, would be to, at least to some extent, at least the basics, make civics and basic politics a requirement, and have people understand this shit, because there's too many people that I meet day to day that just know nothing and like have these really strong convictions based on nothing, like because of feelings. And that fucks up democracy, because then you can easily be swayed, which is what happened now. Like everybody fell for Trump's fucking bullshit crap, and he just put on a fucking bullshit narrative and fucking told people what they wanted to hear and gave them nothing. And now most of the United States is fucked as a result. But still, I don't have very high hopes that people are going to learn and then they're going to go, oh, the reason why this happened is because I'm stupid. That's not going to happen. So it's a problem, but I certainly don't think that fucking a monarchy will solve it. In fact, I think it will be like 5 times worse than it is now under Trump. If Trump was a fucking dictator, which he's fairly close to, he's got way more power than he should have, then yeah, it would be so much worse. Anyhow, I'm kind of repeating myself at this point. I need to go to sleep. So, thank you for your time.